welcome you all on behalf of Virginia Humanities, the producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book. Before we get started, I do have a few kind of housekeeping things that we need to do. I want to remind everyone to silence your cell phones, please. But I would like to let you know that you can tweet about this event, and I would like to encourage you to do so. And when you do, please use the hashtag VABookFest or hashtag VABook2022. Also, I would like to remind you that this festival is free of charge, but it is not free of cost. So if you are able, we would like to invite you to donate by visiting vabook.org. Your support ensures that we may sustain the festival for many more years. Also, after the festival, we would like to invite you to fill out a program evaluation. These provide useful information that helps keep the festival free and open to the public. You can complete it online at vabook.org/feedback, or you can use the QR code on the back of your program. Simply open your phone's app and hold it over the QR code and then select the link that pops up. Okay, as far as COVID precautions go, in order to keep everyone safe, we do ask that you keep your masks on at this event. Some of us are not wearing masks. We have all tested before this event and shown negative tests so that we can remove our masks to make it a little easier for you to hear us up here. And of course, book sales, please support our festival authors and our local booksellers by purchasing a book today. After this event, our authors will be available for book signing in the back of the room, and you can also purchase a book in the back. All right, so once again, this is Eyewitness to the Past, and I'm going to go ahead now and read the short bios of our authors that are present here. So starting at the end of the table, that's Anna-Lysa Gruner. Anna-Lysa is the author of the afterword to The Nation Must Awake. She's the great-granddaughter of the Tulsa survivor, Mary E. Jones Parrish. She is a writer and author and attended Bryn Mawr College. Her writing has appeared in Honey Magazine, Savoy Magazine, USED Frontlines, CNN.com, and The Lily at the Washington Post. Sitting next to me is Gayle Jessup White. She's the author of Reclamation, Sally Jesse Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and A Descendant's Search for Her Family's Lasting Legacy. And she is an award-winning television reporter and an anchor who started her career at the New York Times. Her quest landed her a job at Monticello, making her the first descendant of the enslaved and the enslaver to be employed by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. And then finally in the middle, and also the only gentleman with us today, is Steve Majors. He's the author of Hi, Yella, a modern family memoir. He's a former television news journalist. His essays on race, culture, and identity have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other outlets. He is currently Vice President of Marketing for Teach for America and lives in suburban Maryland with his family. So thank you for joining us, and thank you all. So we're going to get started with each author telling us a little bit about their book. So maybe we'll start with you, Gayle?
That would be lovely. First, let's make sure everyone can hear me. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Leah. Thank you to my fellow panelists. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I'm seeing some old friends. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. And new friends as well. So, what's my book about? My book is part memoir, part detective story, and part history lesson. It's about my multiple decade-long journey to confirm an oral history that my family is descended from Thomas Jefferson. Now this word came down from a woman, my great aunt, a woman I never met, who could not read, write, or even spell her own name. The family called her Aunt Peachy. But we believe so much in Aunt Peachy and what she believed that it sent me on a quest to find out if in fact these words were true. You're a descendant from Thomas Jefferson, she would say frequently. I'm not, she would say, but you are. The book is also, the purpose of the book is also about giving humanity to the people whom Jefferson enslaved, giving humanity to the people I ultimately discovered were my family members. It's also about encouraging people to search and find out their own genealogy and to learn about their own history. In my case, learning my history has helped make me whole. I feel reborn as a result of it. And then, of course, the third purpose is about healing. When we come face to face and we're honest about our history and the pain that we have caused each other, especially enslaved people, marginalized people, and their descendants, then ultimately we can heal as a nation and become one. So those are the, I guess they're kind of lofty goals of the book. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin. Can you all hear me okay? Hello? We'll use this one. Thank you. I think I'd like to begin by thanking you all for joining us, for those of you who are watching via live stream, and most importantly, for the Virginia Festival of the Book for hosting us all here today. I think one thing I think that will become clear as part of this conversation, my fellow authors, my book is less about historical events as my fellow authors and more about family history, but I think that there's certainly something to take away from the story that is universal for everyone. So the book, again, is Hi Yella. And Hi Yella, this is a picture of my family on the cover. I am here the youngest of 5. And if you get a little bit closer, what you can see is that it was very fair complexion in comparison to my family. Because I was mixed race, and my family, my siblings, my mother, my immediate family around me were black. And Hi Yella is a term that has some history and currency in the black community, and it's meant to describe people who are very light complexion, either mixed race or black people. And so this book really is a personal story, personal history. It's the story of 2 families. It is the story of my family of birth and how, over time, I struggled to find my place among them. My search for identity within that family. And my search for identity within the wider world in which they wanted to be the decider of who I was and how I self-identified. And it is also the story of my chosen family. My husband, my 2 children were both adopted, were both black, and the struggles that they faced at some point in their lives in trying, once again, to find their place amongst our family and to find their place in the world at large. Although it is a very personal story, it touches on themes of race, class, identity, and culture. And what I hope is that ultimately, that anyone who picks up the book understands it's a story about the resilience of family. It's about the ability of people to change and grow and become better human beings over time. And so I look forward to the discussion today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the 2 authors at the table with me. I feel honored to be in your presence. My book is a bit different. It does describe a historical event, but it is actually a retelling of a book that was printed in 1923 about the Tulsa race riot of 1921. That book's author was my great-grandmother, Mary E. Jones Parrish. She was a survivor of the Tulsa Massacre, along with her daughter, who was 7 at the time, Florence Mary Parrish Bruner, my paternal grandmother. As the descendant of 2 survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which has over time, taken on a life of its own in terms of how the story was suppressed and how the story re-emerged because of basically historical pressures that forced certain truths to be reckoned with. They are still in the process of being reckoned with because, as we know, most of us by this time, no one has ever been held accountable. No one has ever been repaired or made whole. Reparations have never come to those who survived, the families of those who were killed, nor the descendants. And so this is an ongoing process. Right now, they are in the process of looking for mass graves. There is a huge archaeological dig going on in the city of Tulsa to try to bring some healing, a word that Gayle used so aptly. But this is a personal story for me as well as a historical one. In the book, there's a description of the young mother, Mary Jones Parrish, and her daughter, my Granny Florence, fleeing on foot from bullets flying around, airplanes dropping turpentine bombs on the buildings, people coming through with the intent to loot and murder. And so I am able to look at this original book, which is part of this compilation in its full text, except for the ads that they used to finance part of the book when it was published. I'm able to look directly at the moment when they emerged from their apartment onto the street. And I know for certain that at that moment, had they not survived, I would not be here. So that is it is a pinpoint, it is an inflection point for me and my family, and the courage, the bravery, the absolute faith in God that Mary Jones Parrish exhibited in those moments of decision, whether to stay in the house and risk being burned, as many were, burned alive, or to flee into the dangerous street, into the night. She made the right decision, and I'm here with you to share this book, her story, and in the afterward essay, my own interpretation of what that means in terms of reckoning for us today. Thank you.
Move this off. Thank you all for those summaries. The first question I have is about your backgrounds in terms of how you approach this process of kind of uncovering what happened. So you all kind of have this professional background in communications and in media work. So how did that experience, how did that influence how you went about researching and writing these books?
Well, first of all, I was born with a natural curiosity. So that really helped a lot. The same skills that writers use and authors use are the same skills that journalists use for writers, after all. And so I had this innate interest once I learned of the oral history, and I'd be happy at some point to talk about how I learned it. It wasn't from Aunt Peachy. In fact, may I cover that right now really quickly? Is that okay? It wasn't from Aunt Peachy that I learned it. It was through my oldest sister, Janice Terry, who was also married to a journalist. I am married to a retired journalist. And my sister was just back from Asia, where her husband was covering the Vietnam War for Time magazine. My sister is very glib and very glamorous. And she talks and talks and talks and talks. And during the course of the conversation I overheard her have with my father, I heard my sister say, and I said, I'm descended from Thomas Jefferson. Well, I was shocked to hear this. Growing up in Washington, D.C. at the age of 13 years old, I'd never, ever heard this from any family member. We never talked about anything like this. Jefferson was also my favorite president at that time. That's before Barack Obama. And I was really intrigued. So I went to my dad and I asked him about it. And Daddy says, well, that's what they say. And that's all he said. But I should say that my dad was 6'2", had freckles, Aside from a slope here on the bridge of his nose was straight, and his mother was from Charlottesville. So those are really heavy clues. The same kinds of clues that journalists use were the clues I was gathering, not knowing at the age of 13 and beyond that I would one day write a book about it. It turns out, I eventually learned from my sister, the story she was relaying to my dad occurred when she and her husband were the guests of honor at the American Embassy in Saigon. A small dinner party. My sister and her husband, this would have been in the late 1960s. My husband, no Jack, I'm not talking about you right now. My sister and her husband were the only blacks at the table. And at the table, everyone there, all Americans, were discussing their lineage as if they were descended from royalty. Now, my sister wanted to remind these folks that we had fought a war to separate ourselves from the monarchy. So she was going to straighten them out. Now remember, this is a different era. So my sister looks toward her husband, my brother-in-law, late brother-in-law, to just get a little permission from him. And he nods because he knows what's coming. And my sister, beautiful, glamorous as ever, tall, raises herself to her greatest height. She has a swan-like neck, and she says, well, I'm descended from Thomas Jefferson. The room, she said, went dead silent. You could hear only the silver touching the china. And this is the story that carried me through the decades that led us here for this conversation today. As I listened to Anneliese, much of what she said resonated with me because I do believe, Anneliese, that you're inspired by your ancestors. Absolutely. And I could sense you getting a little emotional as you told your story, because it is an emotional experience for us. Were it not for the bravery, the resilience, the strength of our ancestors, we would not be here. We absolutely would not be here. And our stories are important because they reflect an American story and our ability to survive and our ability to build and contribute to our nation. And yes, we do have a great nation, flawed as it is a great nation. So these stories are important. And they're told through the lens of people whose voices and whose ancestors' voices were suppressed or ignored for hundreds of years. So yes, those journalistic skills came into play. Principally for me, it was being curious. Ultimately, I did learn how to go through court records, all the processes that journalists go through, asking lots of questions. That's the most important thing, not being afraid. But I think I was born with that. I don't think I needed to go to Howard University and Northwestern to learn those things. It just came naturally to me.
And I know we have limited time, so I'd love to hear from Anneliese.
Well, my book came to me as a gift, almost. I live in Washington, D.C., but I am from San Francisco. And that's where my grandmother fled when she got old enough to leave Tulsa. She got out of Dodge, went to California, and her husband, my grandfather, died in World War II in Burma, which it was called at that time. And so she was a person who had a lot of tragedy in her life. She started out with trauma, and it continued. There are many other stories, but that's not for today. But I will say that the book, in its original form, was called Events of the Tulsa Disaster, a small cloth-bound volume, but so very rich. I did not get the book from her. I got it from my father, William Bruner Jr., who lost his father in the war at the age of 8. And so my father was a war orphan. My grandmother was a war widow. And so that impacts me a great deal when I think about people wondering, are Black people patriotic enough? Do we love our country enough? At the time of Tulsa, my great-grandfather on the other side had returned from the European theater in World War I. We love our country. We don't need to explain that any further. But the book came to me from my father, who had been given it by a relative called Carol Jones. I don't know this person, but obviously a relative of Mary Jones Parish. I went home from Washington for a winter break. It was over the Christmas, about 1993, 94. I went into my father's room because he summoned me with this kind of gravitas that I rarely saw from him. And he very solemnly went to his papers, his things, his papers, and filed through them, pulled out an envelope, and he said, I have something for you. He gave me the book, and he said, Lisa, which is what I was called at the time, this book was written by your great-grandmother. I had never heard of this woman. I had never even heard her name, no mention of her whatsoever. And he said, I want you to see if you can do something with it. I flipped through it, and there was a panoramic fold-out photo of the 35 block area that had been Black Wall Street and then became just a pile of rubble. I had never heard of this before, not through any public channels, nor from my very own family. And I was puzzled. I read through it, and I could not believe that it was true. When I returned to Washington and to my job where I had been working in a consulting firm, I worked for McKinsey for 10 years, I knew that I couldn't stay there. There was something else I needed to be doing. So that very year, I left my job hoping that I would find inspiration and the skill that I needed and the connections that I needed to be able to bring forth this story, which I thought was so very important and about which so very few people knew. And so I ended up working at the magazines at BET. And that's how this book really changed my life, not in a hyperbolic way, but actually it changed my life. It changed my career and my direction. And ever since then, I've worked in the editorial field. And bringing this out was the culmination of those years of preparation. So it sounds trite a little bit, but it really did change my life.
Okay, well, I'm going to skip around, though, because I do have a lot of questions, and we are running through time. So, maybe we could talk a little bit about the people in your stories, specifically. And I think maybe we could start by talking about the women in these stories, and I think maybe we'll start with Steve this time. You were surrounded by a lot of very vocal and powerful women, and as you are at this table. So maybe you could comment on how that shaped the telling of your story and your life.
Thank you, yes. I think the oral tradition was very important in my family. We were a family of storytellers. So real briefly, I have a background in television news. And that affinity, that love of story, that's really sort of where this book sprung from. But those stories were handed down from strong women in my family. My grandmother, my aunt, my mother, my older sister. And they really played an important role in shaping who I was and how I saw the world. Now these were not, although I love them deeply and dearly, these were not always perfect people, as none of us are. And so the stories that I tell here about sometimes some very difficult chapters in my family's past are real, they're raw, but they're true. they're authentic. I mean, I will tell you that, you know, sometimes people who pick up the book often ask me, you know, how you portray your family or the stories that you're telling about them. Do you worry about placing them in a negative light and making this seem as if this is how all black families are? Or, you know, demonstrating, are these leading into sort of how people might see black women? And what I say is, number one, this is one family's story. And I also say that it's important, I think, for us all to recognize that there's no individual black experience. There's no one black experience. I'm proud of the women the women in my family. They raised me to be resilient and tough and compassionate. They raised me to be able to read a room very quickly, to stand up for who I am, and to stand up for my family. I will tell you, there have been a couple of times when I have stood in a commercial setting in a store and felt like the person on the other end of the counter wasn't seeing me or seeing my family. And I have sort of, my approach to them is pointed. And the message is, I'm a human being, you're going to respect me in this place. And I will tell you, my daughters have turned to me and they're like, who are you? I am Claudine's grandson. I am Virginia's son. And I am Nisi's brother. I am made up of these women. And so I'm proud to be here among other strong black women, and strong to carry the story of the strong black women in my family as well.
Thank you so much for that. Of course, we've talked about these other women and your stories, Gayle, and yours, Anna-Lysa. Would you tell us a little bit more about the women that kind of populate your stories? For Gayle, I know that you spoke about your mother specifically, and of course your sisters and Aunt Peachy, but also the connection with Sally Hemings and the work you've done around that. So I guess that's a lot. You can really pick from that who you want to talk about, but I'll let you take it.
So I already spoken of Jan, my sister. I'd like you to read about my mother. I can't do my mother justice in the time that we have here. She was really quite extraordinary and a very complex individual. However, I would like to talk about, very briefly, two Sally Hemingses who influenced my life. The first we all know about, the Sally Hemings, who had 6 children with Thomas Jefferson, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. The Sally Hemings, who was a seamstress, a world traveler, a mother, a daughter, and of course an emancipator, because the 4 children she had with Jefferson who survived into adulthood were ultimately freed. So it's important. We know about Sally Hemings, a lot of us. The person, however, who really influenced my family and influenced the person I am today is also named Sally Hemings. And that's part of the detective story, because I did not know this history. All I knew is Aunt Peachy said to Janice, "You're descended from Thomas Jefferson, I'm not, but you are." Aunt Peachy was my grandmother's half-sister, and the descendancy came from my grandmother. We know very little about her. You can also read about her in the book as well. I would encourage you to do that. Sally Hemings, the second Sally Hemings, was my 2 times great-grandmother. Her name in the records, in the census records, is Sally Robinson. So the detective part of it, the journalistic part of it, was uncovering that Sally Robinson was also named Sally Hemings, named after her now famous aunt. Sally Robinson was an extraordinary woman, enslaved, freed, and ultimately a woman who moved her family from here in Charlottesville to Goochland, where she proceeded to buy acres and acres and acres of land, and without a husband. She was either separated or divorced from him. And some of that land survives in our family today. Now, of course, I found this out through the research, through the detective story, through making connections through DNA, finding my family. And all those members I found have a little bit of Sally Hemings Robinson in them. They're well into their 80s and 90s, these women, and they're tough. We keep hearing that word tough. But you know, to be a marginalized person, or come from a marginalized group in America, and to survive, you have to be tough. And we learned that from our mothers, and you know what? We learned it from our fathers too. It was passed down to us. And many of us have not only survived, but we have thrived under onerous conditions, but never anything such as our ancestors experienced. Never. So when I wake up and I have a bad day, from my super cushiony bed, and my lovely white and blue bedroom, I don't want to get up just because I'm tired. I think about what my ancestors had to do. They didn't have a choice. Not only did they get up and do their work, but they passed down character to us. So yes, those women were strong. And yes, those men were strong too. I don't want to discount anyone who made us the people we are today.
I'm glad that you mentioned the word character, Gayle, because there are characters, and there is character. Mary Jones Parrish was also a woman who was divorced. She lived in Tulsa on her own with her one child. She was a teacher. She was a reporter. She was a business owner, which of course she lost with her home. This person is not anyone I knew personally. However, as I have discovered, she went on to teach at Langston University there in Tulsa, which is a school, it was one of the land-grant schools. Langston is actually named for, I think, John Mercer Langston, one of the uncles of the Langston Hughes that we know. But she was an intrepid person, and she was known in her community because when they wanted, when I say they, kind of like the civic energy of the black community there. And there were organizations that people put together in order to further their cause of citizenship, of prosperity, those kinds of things. But when they thought of the person that they wanted to ask, the person they wanted to contract to write this book originally, they thought of her immediately. In the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe, black people had to have a white person to vouch for them in order to be able to be on the street. And my great-grandmother said she had a dilemma because she had never worked for any white person. She had always worked for herself. And so it is an interesting commentary when you think about the independence that these people had. You know, we're talking about 1921. She was born in 1890. It's not that far off of enslavement. Reconstruction. And they're in the heart of basically the Jim Crow era, because at that time, Oklahoma, the government and everything was run by the Klan. You know, 1915, Birth of a Nation comes out. And we know, you know, the kinds of energies and ideologies that were being promoted by that kind of media. But there in Tulsa, she was a big woman, a known person, someone who had the trust of the community that she could pull this off. Her recollections, she collects in the book, but also the eyewitness accounts of dozens of others to whom she wanted to give voice. They had an opportunity to tell their own stories, their own experiences, what it meant to them to have $7,000 burned up in their home. What does $7,000, how much blood, sweat, and tears does that represent in 1921 to people who are living in a segregated town, because that's basically what Greenwood was. There were many black towns in Oklahoma at that time. because black folks couldn't live among white folks at that time. And so they didn't separate themselves as people sometimes claim black people like to be to themselves. We didn't have a choice. But we didn't just make the best of the situation. Again, to Gayle's words, we thrived. And we were thriving. It was a thriving community. To Stephen's point, there were imperfections. There were flaws. There were things that could have been much better. However, it was a community of which they were proud and which I am proud to be descended from. So yes, you know, the women who were there, the men who were there, there were professional people. There were also domestic workers. There were organizations where domestic workers organized themselves, pooled their monies, and when people needed aid, there was someone to help them. This was a well-integrated economy that was going on there. Black people were forbidden to work in the oil industry, which was, oil was the cash crop of Tulsa at the time. And so it was a very sophisticated place. It was a place with influences from around the world because people were coming there to see if they could make their fortunes. Mary Jones Parrish, in her book, says, "But I came not to make my fortune, but because of the wonderful spirit of cooperation that I saw among the businessmen and businesswomen in Black Wall Street." And so these are the kinds of people that we are celebrating with these stories.
Okay, so all of these stories, as I was reading through them, what I thought about was two things. And the first one was, there's a common stereotype of black people as being lazy and degenerate and all these things. And a characteristic that so many of the people in your stories, in your memoirs, share is ambition, all the way from, you know, Mary E. Jones Parrish, who's very ambitious. Even the Pops, though, has some kind of ambitious, and your whole family, Gayle, is just filled with ambitious people. You're a very complex mother. So I wonder if you would just tell us about how ambition or failed ambition shaped your stories. Maybe we could start with Steve.
My grandmother and her people grew up not too far from here in Culpeper, Virginia. My grandmother was a third-grade dropout. She was part of the Black migration to New York after World War II. My grandmother cleaned toilets, scrubbed floors, took in mending for a living. Her children, she, in spite of her lack of education, she believed in the power of an education. Her children, some completed high school, some did not. All of them worked. In my family, some of us went to college, some completed, some did not. A generation later, I think about the fact that in spite of my grandmother's lack of education, and in some cases some might say her lack of worldliness, she understood the power of an education. She understood that it was the key to economic mobility. And so a generation later, this woman who's a third-grade dropout has children and great-grandchildren who are doctors and lawyers and teachers. I myself work in the education sector, and I think of the irony of that, my grandmother who didn't have a third-grade education. And so for me, ambition is, we talk about character in the Black community and strength in the Black community. Another value is ambition. There are plenty of stories of failed ambition and failed dreams, but equally, there are stories of fulfilled ambition, continued ambition. And so I think about that, what I hope comes out in my stories and the stories that we're all telling here is about a people who, for whom ambition is a strong and closely held value.
There's really little I can add to that, but our story seems so similar in that regard, with the ambition, the drive, the families, one generation out of enslavement, the next generation, as in the case with my I have to think about it sometimes, my two times great-grandmother, Sally Hemings Robinson, the one who bought what ultimately ended up being acres, hundreds of acres of land. Her children became farmers. Her grandchildren, just as they did in your family, left Virginia for places, exotic places like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, where they became doctors, lawyers, educators. In the case of my grandmother, a homemaker, married to a civil servant. We would call him a civil servant today. It was actually a laborer for the printing office, which would have been a good job for a black man back in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, her own great-grandchildren ended up at places like UVA, where our distinguished poet Rita Dove holds court, and Howard University, where my father attended school, where I went to undergrad, and MIT, where my son graduated some 10 years ago, and it just goes on and on and on. I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes because I'm at that age when you do that sort of thing. And when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think about US presidents a lot. It just so happens that last night I was thinking about black culture. And I was thinking of that because of what's happening in Ukraine, quite frankly, and how Putin has claimed that this country has no culture. And those people have found their identity, they have found their national culture, and they're fighting for it. And I started thinking about the black culture in America. And the stereotype you just mentioned, black people have a stereotype of being lazy, but you know what's part of our culture? Education. As you said, Steve, education. Well, those people who were emancipated in 1865, the first thing they wanted to do was learn how to read. And that hasn't been lost in the black community. There are people to this day who strive to get the best education they possibly can, because it leads to economic opportunity and because it's just nice to know. Some people just want to know, love knowledge. That's part of the black culture that we don't talk enough about, that we need to celebrate and honor. So yes.
Ambition is absolutely at the core of the Tulsa story, Black Wall Street. But I do have a story of failed ambition and what happens to people. I mentioned that my great-grandmother taught at Langston University. My grandmother, Florence Parrish Bruner, was a graduate of Langston University. She was a teacher in Tulsa, along with her husband, who would later be killed in the war. But their opportunities were limited, and also the memories were very heavy. They went to San Francisco, and my grandmother, Granny Florence, who had been a teacher in Oklahoma, and who took the teacher's exam for the San Francisco Unified School District, scoring first or second in that cohort, but she could not be hired as a black woman. They did hire her, she couldn't be hired as a teacher as a black woman. She worked for the San Francisco Unified School District as a janitor to support her family. Her children had been taken from her by her mother-in-law in Tulsa, but they joined her, my father and his brother, once they graduated from high school. My father had a scholarship to San Jose State University, and my uncle a scholarship to the University of San Francisco. She supported them on a janitor's salary. But she was a woman who was educated Her mother knew the world, so you know that she did as well. But imagine, we think, what happens to a dream deferred? My grandmother suffered from alcoholism, and ultimately it was, the end of her. But I didn't know all of these things. I didn't know all of these things. But, oh, the irony of her great-grandson, my son. He was teaching at the Oakland Unified School District up until a couple of years ago. So back to the Bay Area. And again, full circle. But although we look at the current generation and we think to ourselves, it all turned out fine, there was a heavy price that people paid along the way. And we can never forget that. Florence Bruner paid a very heavy price for bringing her family to San Francisco. And she died in anonymity, basically. But if my way is had, her story will continue to shine. Not only her triumphs, but her tragedy as well. That's a part of the human condition.
Thank you all so much for that. I think maybe we might have time for one more question here. So I'm going to try to, I had a whole list of questions. I'm going to try to make this a good one to close on before I open up to the audience. You were all collecting histories from kind of key people in your families who kind of were the tradition bearers and the story keepers. And now that you have written these books, that's who you are. So how is it for you now to play that role in your family?
I love that question. And it's because I get to say this. I'm the happiest I've ever been in my life. I love being the storyteller in my family. I love gathering my nieces and nephews around and telling them about our history. I love having collected these stories from my sister Janice, principally from Janice and then from others. And I love the next step, which is going to be to tell the story of my mother's family. Just for clarification, when people see a black person who says she's descended from Thomas Jefferson, the immediate assumption is that that person's descended from Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Well, in fact, I'm descended from one of Jefferson's great-great-grandsons, and I'm descended in the Hemings family from a brother of Sally Hemings, which is in itself interesting when you think of the history. And that's because it tells us how multi-layered and those family connections were, beginning with Jefferson's father-in-law and going right down to Jefferson's great-great-grandson, my great-grandfather. That's number one. Number two, my mother's family was off the chain. She had a fabulous family with great, big personalities. People we need to learn about because they, again, speak to the American condition and the condition of black folk and what we had to go through. My grandfather was a famous chef, which I did not know. Mom used to talk about him in a sort of haphazard way because that's how she was. But he was a famous chef who worked for the most racist president of the 20th century. You mentioned Birth of a Nation? Well, who was the most racist president of the 20th century? There you go. Give that man a gold star. My grandfather worked for him. He was a chef for him. And he was huge in his personality. And when you think of what he had to maneuver, what he had to go through to get along with Wilson, who apparently adored him. My grandfather was written about in newspapers. So I'm going to use him to tell the story of 20th century America and to speak a little bit of colorism, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today, which is not a part of the current book I've written, but which will be a part of the next book. So, yes, those are some of the things we're dealing with now, and it has absolutely changed my life. And Lisa, you mentioned going to work at BET changed your life. And this really does happen. Going to work at Monticello changed my life dramatically. It changed the way I see the world, because I started seeing the world through the lives of my enslaved ancestors and through the people who oppressed them. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson was all that to me when I was 13. Well, now I know the real deal, folks. And you should too. Jefferson owned 607 people during his lifetime. Men, women, and children, which he would mortgage, sell, gift, whatever, as you would cattle. It's important to know those stories. So yes, it was life-changing. And I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the platform. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm grateful for your questions and for what I learned today. It was really invaluable.
Just briefly, that question just hit me heavy in a way that I really didn't expect. Anneliese, you talked about, family members who have died in anonymity. And both of your families, in some respects, were eyewitnesses to history. Not so much mine. We were just a family. And I think about my people, and they're gone now, for the most part. And they struggled. And there were many failed dreams and failed ambitions. And the things that they did so that I would have a better life. And I wrote this story for them so that they didn't die in anonymity. They're alive to me today because I wrote this book. And they're alive to so many other people. And their stories are worthy of being told. Thank you.
Viola Davis, when she accepted the Academy Award, said that you want to know some stories, go to the graveyard. So many people have carried their stories with them into eternity, we'll never know them. But up here today, we have an opportunity to share with you the stories that have shaped us and stories that have shaped this nation. And as this nation is shaped, so is the world. What have we contributed? Look at these books. In this book that Mary Jones Parrish published first in 1923, she likened the attack in Tulsa to the pogroms in Armenia and Russia. They talked about the Mexican Revolution. These were people who knew their place in the world, and they knew how important what they did on a daily basis was. I'm certainly hoping that all of us know that we have an important part to play, no matter how small, in making a difference in the course of the world. I have told countless young people who have come to hear me speak, I've been so grateful for that opportunity. Talk to your folks. Ask them, what have they witnessed with their own eyes? And remember that what we live today and every day, it is actually history being made. I came to this book, this ultimate compilation here, because of the January 6th events. And that is how I was galvanized to write the essay that appeared in the Washington Post that brought me to the attention of the people who were, some people who were doing this work. And so we wonder, what can we do? Write that article. Send out that tweet. That's how an editor got in touch with me and asked me to write some more stories. I mean, it seems serendipitous. It is. I got that book and it changed the course of my life. So thank you all for sitting up here with me and giving me strength and teaching me more. I appreciate it. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much. That was so uplifting. I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions from the audience. We have a mic set up in the back, so if you have a question, I would love it if you would maybe make your way, or if you want to, let's have people make their way to the back, or if you feel like you want to raise your hand, or however we want to do this. Are there any questions in the audience? Please. Oh, no, please go to the back. Yes, to the back. Yes, thank you.
I'll be loud. So my question is, in gathering the information for your stories, was there a time in a conversation with a relative that you had trouble getting them to tell you their part of the story? And so how did you get through that? I have some family members who went through something very traumatic, and I tried to get them to talk about it, and it's been very difficult. So I'm curious to know if you experienced that, how you worked it out.
So just for the people streaming, who might be streaming, the question was whether or not it was difficult to get some of the relatives to tell their stories.
I'd be happy to answer that question. The first person I mentioned earlier, I went to find out, to confirm whether in fact Aunt Peachy's story was true that we're descended from Jefferson, was my dad. My dad was a reticent person, the absolute opposite of my mother, who was totally gregarious. Dad kept his own counsel, he kept to himself, and was loath to discuss the past, which I reveal in the book, at least the reasons that he didn't like to discuss the past. However, my approach was this. I found something that Daddy and I could share together, and that was watching football. We were both fans of the Washington football team, now called the Commanders, which is just a dreadful name. So every Sunday, sometimes Monday, I would join Dad in his cave in the basement of the house. And we would watch football together, and sometimes we watched golf together. That was really hard for me. And just started conversation, just casual, relaxing conversation. And then I would kind of sneak the question in. Daddy, what about your mom being from Charlottesville? Well, Dad, what was your mom's name? Well, what do you know about your mom? And, you know, have you heard that Jefferson thing? What about that, Dad? And it was constant. Another characteristic of a reporter, tenacity. I persevered. I was unrelenting. But I eased into it. Very gently, became his best friend. And before I knew it, Dad was telling me his whole childhood. It was just pouring forth from him. So that's the method I used to find a reluctant, or to extract from a reluctant relative, my dad in this case, stories that he really didn't want to talk about. At least on the surface he didn't. But inside, somewhere deep inside of him, he wanted to. He wanted to unload that burden he'd been carrying his entire life. Just as your family member, deep inside, they want to let it out. So that's what I did, and perhaps you can find some help with that.
Well, I didn't have the opportunity, unfortunately, to interact with some of my forebears the way I would today have wanted to. But in my relationship with my father, who did not live through the disaster, but who was aware of it, obviously, the only thing that he ever said to me was, "Do you still have that book? Do you still have that book?" He was giving me a charge. He hoped that I would do something with it. And that's what he said when he gave it to me. "I want you to see if you can do something with it." I felt that he was telling me, I don't know what to do with it, but I have confidence that you, at this point in your life, I was in my mid-30s, that you can do something with it. He felt it was important. He recognized the significance of it. He did not know how he could bring this story forward because, of course, he had lived under the silencing. Obviously, his mother had as well. I believe, however, that when he was asking me this, that he was saying, I don't care anymore what people's reaction might be. I want this told, and I know that you can do it. And I was in my mid-30s, as I said, and he said that at that time, which I could not understand. He said, you're the matriarch of the family now, which was jaw-dropping. I was shocked. I was not the oldest female in the family, but he told me that it's your responsibility, basically, to take care of this, get this out there, and I can't give you any guidance on how to do it, but take care of it.
Yeah, there's a heavy responsibility when you are tasked with being the one who holds your family's history. And it often falls to the women in the family, and sometimes it falls to the youngest. It doesn't matter. I happen to be the youngest. And so when I think about getting these stories out of my family, there is a truism. There are the stories that are told, and then there are secrets that are withheld. And there's some things that will be unknowable. And I think we tell our stories as best and as honest and as truthful as we know them to be in that moment. And we hope that there are larger truths. If there are mysteries, things that are mysteries within or secrets that are withheld, you hope that by sharing what you know, that there are larger truths that you can impart.
All right, we have other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I've been involved with the book festival since the first year, and this is a truly great program. I want to say that first. Secondly, I just wanted to ask you, has your material been out long enough for you to know that you've gotten feedback of how it's gone on to influence other people?
So the question is, how has your material influenced other people?
Wow, well, how has it influenced you? That's the only gauge I have, is when we have audiences like this and people are attentive and attend. And so in that regard, I would say that it's been very positive. That's been my experience thus far. I don't teach. I don't have, I work at Monticello. Every once in a while, someone will hear my voice and say, oh, I heard you on High on the Hog, and that's what we visited Monticello today. But my hope is that this work does influence people, as I mentioned earlier, to seek out their own genealogical backgrounds and their family backgrounds, and to work together. Everyone is masked today. That's really part of the message. That's part of being American. That's part of being human, taking care of each other, working together. So these are, again, lofty goals. And that's about all I can say about that. Maybe I need to hire a marketing person.
I'll only speak from the lens of I'll start with the lens of my family. I think there was great appreciation from those who are still with me that these stories were collected and captured, and that I tried to make meaning. Because I think ultimately that is the role of a writer. You're making meaning of something, of events, of experiences. And I think that they appreciated my attempt to do so. I will tell you, there is one family member that I didn't tell that I was going to write the book. And it was the matriarch of my family, my aunt. And there were some very difficult things that I had to write about her. And when the book finally came out and she became aware of it, I was like, oh, she's gonna call and cuss me out, that is it. And I didn't want that, because this is a woman who I need to be in relationship with. She's the last tie to the past for me. And she called me up, and I said, I want you to read it from the beginning into the end. Because there's redemption in there for you, and there's redemption for us all. I wrote difficult things about myself in this book. And she called me back and she said, thank you. Thank you. There were difficult things that I had to read about myself, and I might not really understand or agree with them all, but I understand you did so with compassion and an open heart, and your understanding of what I was going through at a particular point in my life. And ultimately, I think that's all we can do, is we can hope to shape, whether it's our family or readers like you, hope that these books help you make meaning of a circumstance, of history, of something in your own lives.
I was fortunate that last year was the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and so it was a perfect opportunity to come, timing-wise, to come out with this book. But it had a life of its own beforehand, and in that life, it became the primary source of information about the race massacre for most of the scholarship that has been done about that event. And so I'm very proud of that. And that was told to me by the person who participated in the front matter, Dr. Scott Ellsworth, who was a native of Tulsa and has made it his career to unearth and tell the story of the race massacre. And so I can say, without a doubt, this has been a very influential work, and I am proud to be able to bring it to an even broader audience, not just an academic audience. And with this trade publication, that's what's happening. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have participated. I've written other things, and I primarily write within the corporate setting. But it is the most pride I've felt in having anything that I've written published, to have that be alongside the words of my intrepid great-grandmother. There is no greater feeling for me as a writer.
I would just like to add a couple of things very quickly. Redemption seems to play a role in all of our books. And in addition to that, secrets and honesty. You have to be able to really reveal yourself in sometimes a painful way in a memoir. And if my parents, who are not here, they've gone to their heavenly place. If my parents were still here, I would not have been able to write this book. Their deaths, well, they were very painful, and I would never have been able to anticipate this, but it emancipated me, so that I could tell a story that I hope will help people, that I believe will help people without harming anyone. I would never want to harm my parents. They were precious to me. I adored them. But there's always redemption. And for them in this book, in our books, there was redemption. But, so they're experiencing that redemption in heaven. It would not have paid for them to have it here on earth.
Thank you so much. So maybe let's, I think you guys are maybe a little bit of a shy audience, so maybe we can let you save some of your questions. Oh wait, we have one more question. Yes.
Maybe not. That's all right. I'll try to be loud. This has been such a wonderful program. Thank you all so much for telling your stories. I'm thinking about how to pass these stories on to our children, our grandchildren, to kids in school. The need for that, the need for healing in our country. We need to encourage people to feel that all of their stories are important and contribute to our national story and to the national good. Can one of you or several of you address that question of how we can get these stories out into the world and to the next generations that are coming up now?
So the question is, how do we pass these stories on and get them out to the next generation?
I'll start briefly. I think this is a perfect example. I think that writers are in relationship with readers. And our hope is that in relationship with you, that you take our stories and pass them on. Pass the book, make a recommendation, tweet, make sure that these are in your local libraries. Ask your local bookstores whether you're carrying them. And I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is, I feel that obligation myself. I'm currently working, well, I have a young adult manuscript that actually deals with some of the same themes, but is more targeted towards that audience. And so I think as writers, we have this responsibility to really keep our readers in mind and to understand that, you know, as much as we can broaden the audience and be able to tell these stories to as many people, to make them accessible to as many people, no matter their age, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, as much as we can make sure we're lifting up universal truths for folks, no matter what we're writing about. In that way, we're certain really to make sure that those stories are out there for everyone.
The theme of universal truth is so important at this time right now, because obviously we're in an age of disinformation and manipulation of public memory. And if we are to ever truly heal, we know that without truth, there is no reconciliation. Truth is knowable, despite what some of the pushers of disinformation would say. It is knowable. The things that we need to do are educate ourselves and educate those around us about, you know, verifiable reality, and hold ourselves and others to account in terms of making sure that verifiable reality is promulgated and not disinformation.
Okay, I want to make sure that we have a chance to have autographs with the authors afterwards, so we will wrap up the question and answering. And how about a final round of applause for our authors? Thank you so much for being here, all of you, people who may be watching. We're going to have them step to the table in the back. If you would like to meet them back there, we have books for sale in the back there. We would like to encourage you to please purchase the book and please chat with the authors and ask them your questions and tell them your comments. Thank you again so much for coming.